There's obviously some people still dripping in, but thanks everybody for attending and you guys being on the panel. It's actually, it's got a big achievement from today. Obviously, there's a huge day today. We've got the first human trial for commencing in Melbourne. Today, we've got the first human trial for commencing in Melbourne. So obviously Victoria can take that, obviously, for their win today, which will be really interesting to see what happens over the next couple of weeks. ScoMo also is announcing Nation today on the economic road to recovery. And obviously to top it off, we're doing Talenza, which this is our first ever online webinar. So we're a little bit slightly anxious. Obviously we've done many events, but it's amazing that obviously what the world's pivot us towards us doing. And obviously the topics we're running today is all about the future workforce. We're going to break that into the two key components. We're going to start with the new world company, and then the second half is going to be around the new world employees. So we're going to touch across everything around org design, structure, automation, well-being, resilience, future skill sets. But before we get into that, I'll hand you over to the panel to give you a short introduction, background of themselves. So let's start with the ladies. Danielle, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll just unmute myself. Hi everyone, I'm Danielle Owen-Whitford, the CEO and founder of Pioneer. And Pioneer is an AI platform to help reduce stress and promote wellness in the workplace. And we're turning the old adage of you need to do surveys to help people on its head. So we're helping people basically by understanding the way that we talk and the way that we behave, and intervening with tips in real time to help reduce stress and promote wellbeing. Has been particularly popular now that we're all working from home and we can't see each other like we were before. My background is large corporate, so I've spent 20-something years in big companies running retail networks, call centers, and large-scale transformation. So this is my first foray into small business and has been very, very fun.
Cool.
And great to be with you all.
Laura, I know we agreed to go last, but actually, sorry.
I know.
First, so I know. I never stick to the script. Don't worry.
I'm Laura Petrocelli. I'm the Director of People for Catena APAC. My career has fundamentally been in HR and people operations for about 15 or 16 years now, largely in the digital and IT space. So this has been obviously a really interesting time to be in HR and people, and has really kept me on my toes. So I really look forward to obviously talking to you all about some of the things that we've adapted and adopted in our practices at Catena.
Legend. Francisco?
Hi, everybody. I'm Francisco. I'm one of the lead recruiters for engineering over at Canva. We make graphic design tools that are web-based and browser-based. I've been in recruitment for about 10 years throughout sort of Asia Pacific. Despite the heavy accent. I've been with Canva for about 4. So I've been with the business. It was about maybe 50 to 60 people when I started. We're now over 930 globally in just 4 years. So went through that sort of hyper growth trajectory and learned some pretty interesting things along the way. So yeah, hopefully I can, contribute from sort of a recruitment and hiring perspective. I'm really excited to, be part of this panel. So thank you.
And got probably one of the coolest emails I've ever come across with Disco.
Oh yeah, that too. Yeah, everyone calls me Disco, so just a heads up. You can call me that.
Michael, to you.
Yeah, sure. So Michael Ewald, I'm the Director of Engineering at Catena. I'll say a little bit about Catena because I think it makes sense to the input we're putting in today. So at Catena, we help highly regulated enterprises with measurable transformation through the adoption of enterprise DevOps and cloud-native computing data platforms to help them shape their new ways of working as well. So part of my background is I've been in startups to government to enterprise, over 20 years in tech, been a consultant for a long time, went into enterprise as a full-time employee. So yeah, I've worked in lots of places and seen lots of things and got lots of war stories, which I'll share relevant to this as we talk and answer some questions.
And last but not least, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm Matt Hughes, CEO and founder of Ripen Psychology. I spent 10 plus years in corporate finance, consulting and strategy before retraining in psychology to learn the resilient skills of elite performers. Since March 2016, we've been delivering resilient skills training to individuals and teams across Australian businesses and industries, including fin services, healthcare, mining, professional services, software, tech, university, you name it, we've kind of played there. Our training actually provides practical and proven mindset and behaviour strategies for optimal performance at work. And in late 2019, given the remote and international footprint of the organisations and teams we work with, we decided to turn our training into a digital course for reaching more people globally. And this proved to be a timely pivot because since COVID-19 hit hard in March here, we've been able to put close to 1,000 people through our digital resilience courses for helping them thrive through this challenging work and social situation. So I don't have my crystal ball able to predict the future today. So instead, for the discussions, I'm hoping to bring some of the insights from building and running resilience courses at scale, and perhaps any expertise I can offer on mindset and performance more broadly. So thanks for having me.
Cool. And then just to the attendees, we're going to cover a lot of areas today, but by all means, throw some questions in the Q&A section if you have any. We'll try and cover them off as we go or at the end, or it might just be that I know that you've asked a question that we're going to be answering already, so we'll come to it through. But let's kick off then. First question, first component is all around the new world company. The COVID crisis has brought about immediate and profound changes to the way that we approach work. And as we look to the future, what will the impact on the way businesses manage their approach to people? So if it's okay, Laura, we're going to hand to you to have to kick us off, and then by all means, the panel, just talk amongst yourselves with it as well.
Sure. I think we're still obviously only really early in the early stages of the change cycle. So, there's still plenty of trial and error and refinement still to come. But fundamentally, I think one of the biggest changes, in how we approach our people is we really are being forced to rethink how we define performance. Greater autonomy needs to be provided to individuals to carry out their roles, and in turn, more of a focus rather than, the number of hours that they spend in the office. It really challenges our traditional thought process that if I can't see them, how do I know that they're doing their job? And moves us away from that concept of an 8-hour day. And this has both positives and negatives. For some, I know that it's meant that they're working a longer day because, there's a blurred line as to when their day starts and ends. And for others, being able to focus on producing a quality outcome, I know has meant that they've worked a shorter day because they've been able to achieve what they need to achieve in fewer hours with less disturbances. So I think, being provided with greater flexibility, it removes some of the boundaries that, while we're provided with greater flexibility, it has also, removed some of the boundaries that have traditionally been respected. So, at 5 o'clock, historically, you perhaps got to go home and people, stopped calling you. Whereas now, because your work day starts and ends at different times, it's going to be more common to have a phone call at 7 or 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And so I think, we need to change the way that we think, and individuals need to take some responsibility also on setting some boundaries as to, how they want to set up their workday and when things become, when their workday is going to start and end. So it's going to be really interesting. I think also the way we communicate is being challenged, and it's become paramount. It's always been an important factor, but now where you can't see each other every day, where you're not passing each other in the kitchen, and you're not having those informal conversations, you now need to be conscious about how you communicate and be conscious about what you write in a Slack message, or when's the right time to pick up the phone or have a Zoom meeting or whatever it might be. It's really challenged and changed the way that we communicate every day. And I think it's really put them and to engage in more contemporary leadership practices in how they can, step up and provide guidance and leadership for their team, which, I think historically is not, well, this is unfounded. This is uncharted. It's not something that we've been challenged with before. So, I think we're going to be faced with lots of different impacts, and we are still navigating our way through it. So, yeah.
And then yourself or Francisco, have you implemented anything about the way you've already adapted to this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's interesting because a lot of what you said, especially when you hit communication, I was like, oh, that's the big one for at least us in talent acquisition, right? Because we're constantly relaying messages back and forth between interviewers, between hiring managers, between candidates. And you're correct. In the old days, it was like, if I needed to find Jim, I know he was down on level 2 somewhere, and if he saw me coming, he knew we had to talk about something. We can get it sorted. Now it's like, hey, Jim, Slack message, nothing, or email, nothing, or ring him, nothing. And, it is a bit trickier because, he's got his own set of responsibilities and stuff like that. So one of the things that we've sort of, and it's funny because we've implemented things and then unimplemented them. Like we moved meetings to Zoom, but then we were all getting Zoom burnout. So let's not do it on Zoom. Or we can do it over the phone instead. So we can kind of walk around our house and do things. So in terms of like how we communicate, I think it's still a moving target. But we found that, I think being open and taking responsibility for not encroaching on other people's time is really important. So we've had a lot of chats around that. Like, don't call me at 8 o'clock. I'm watching TV. And I think that's helped. I think that's helped the mood because we've been taking sort of weekly surveys ever since this began. And it's like, it's been, it's like, oh, this is great, or no, this is terrible, or this is okay, or now it's great again. So I think being flexible is probably the most important bit. But in terms of like policies, we just have to revisit them every week and say, hey, is this working? Hey, is this not? Or, hey, should we do this on Slack? Or, hey, is this better for a Zoom call? So like nothing concrete, because I don't think we've figured out what works best for everyone yet. Everyone has different needs.
Francisco, I think you need to have a word with Jim if he's ignoring your Slack and your
generic name, not an actual person.
Okay. I think it's a really, really good point. And I think, Laura, you've touched on a really good point as well in terms of the communication factor from leadership down as well. I think one of the key considerations that organisations need to lean into at the moment is, do we race back to old behaviours and ways of working to rapidly regain the loss in growth? Or do we take this time to regroup, re-innovate and redefine how we operate for the future? From an organisation or team level, I think this will largely come down to what makes sense for each team or organisation as a whole. For publicly listed companies, their fiduciary duty to maximise shareholder profits will mean they're going to do whatever is required to achieve the most capital growth. For example, if a remote workforce makes sense for profits, then that's likely the way a for-profit organisation will go. But if the business case for productivity and profits of a remote workforce can't be proven, it's likely we'll see organisations piloting these new communications or these new norms for not much longer than is absolutely necessary. So I think one of the key things, in terms of how organisations are managing their approach to people is, do we expect people to simply catch up with previous growth curves, or is this an opportunity to regroup, re-innovate and redefine how we operate for the future?
Great.
Oh, sorry, Sally.
Carry on, Danielle, go.
No, I was just going to agree with everyone's points. I think the tricky thing now is that whilst we try not to think of one size fits all, when you're talking about organisations that get bigger and bigger and bigger, we find the processes become one size fits all because we're trying to be efficient, and our brains love efficiency. So they race to an answer so we can move to the next thing. And I think now that we're at this environment where we've all been forced to work from home. So most organisations have been trying to roll out flexible working and remote working for some years and various degrees of success and a fair bit of resistance. I was doing this in my old company 5 years ago, and even then we were facing resistance 5 years ago, and I know that's continued. So, but we've all been forced overnight. It's happened. We've had no control over it. We've had to make it up. I'm in my garage. Everyone's in different sort of spaces, in their bedrooms, in their hallways. We've had kids at home. So we've been forced to find a new way of working. And for the most part, it's worked. I mean, there have been some challenges. There's been quite a bit of stress. There's been some anxiety and mental health issues are starting to rise. So we're seeing socially there are challenges we need to deal with. But I think also then as organisations, we're realising perhaps the one size fits all is not the way to go. So to everyone's point, we're not all the same. We don't all communicate the same. We have to find new ways of working, and we have to be considerate. And Laura, you talked about discipline and boundaries, and I think that's really, really important. What I'm seeing, we've got really big customers and really small customers. We run the gamut. but everyone is saying the same thing. They're now actually working more. So they're at their desks earlier, they're at their desks later, they're contactable all the time, they're not leaving the house to go to work. So we're seeing sort of stress and potential burnout starting to rise, which obviously is a concern when you talk about MAT growth, and we need to come out of this positively as a, you know, as a country, as much as an economic, you know, focus. But we need to be aware that we've got to put some of those boundaries, some of those disciplines in place, and think about how we can actually deal with people as individuals.
Is that a little bit, so is that a little bit down to the individuals as well, though? Because so many conversations you keep hearing, it's all being pushed back on the business to come up with all these ideas, and it's very much on, oh, my leader hasn't done this, or my business hasn't done this, and there's obviously some good and the bad stuff. But then, how do you get the information? Because it's down to the employees, right, also to help redefine this as well.
Totally. And Sally, I'm not saying the organisation is responsible for all of that, because we're all adults. You know, we're adults and we're professionals when we go to work. We are absolutely 100% responsible for ourselves. We're responsible for the way that we work. We're responsible for the way that we engage with others. Totally. This needs to be two-way. This needs to be a collaborative effort. So organisations can provide as much policies and processes and systems as they like, and every single person has experienced this. We all know policies, and then we all know whether or not we follow them. So that's actually entirely up to us. Do we follow them? Do we provide input? Do we take leadership on ourselves and say, actually, I'm responsible for myself. I'm going to contribute here. I'm going to help my peers. And we absolutely should. We should never be falling back to the company to say, it's your issue. You sort it out and come to me. We should all be taking an active role. And I think the last couple of months have shown us that we do need to step up and start taking active roles if we weren't before.
I still think that they're all really interesting points. I think it's something that's not spoken about in the workplace, and it's based upon my observations. I've seen that, and yes, there's policies in place for flexible work, and government says, yes, they take a flexible first approach, flexibility is built in, but what there is this unspoken rule around taking flexibility. And I think what COVID, because I think where I've worked before, management actually really resistant. They didn't like, 1 day a week was fine working from home. More than that, there's this sense of, because I can't see you, I'm not across the output of work. There's because we weren't measuring probably very well. I think that COVID and this remote working has answered that question, that work can still definitely go on. The reason I'm highlighting is my wife's actually doing a PhD on this, around the barriers that especially men trying to get flexibility in their work. And there's these unspoken rules as well. So I think that, yes, there's policies in place, but I think we need to, as the expectation would be for employers, is there'll be a lot of people that will not want to come back, and they'll need to build that remote work in. How are they going to measure that? How are they going to measure that output still happening?
Yeah. Cool. And then obviously this one leads us in then. So how will businesses' operating models change? You know, and then obviously the part of that is what tech and digital capabilities are required. And maybe you guys might be able to speak to your own personal businesses and then clients that you might have seen. But so, you know, to that, you know, how will businesses' operating models change and what tech's needed?
Sally, can I just, I think we've got to acknowledge here that we're going through a crisis. And when we go through a crisis, there's three things that the most effective leaders and organizations do. So whatever the new business model looks like, the three things that leaders and organizations need to do is, firstly, they need to validate concerns. Second, they need to show action. And thirdly, they need to control the narrative. So if we consider the government, for example, in their handling of COVID-19, just a very quick example, in terms of validating concerns, they did this very well. Scott Morrison was regularly on the news saying, we know Australians are feeling concerned about their jobs, their livelihood, the well-being of their loved ones. And here's what we're doing about it, or here's what we can do together to minimise the impact. So they validated concerns really well. They then showed action. So the results of the action taken are clear, with the minimal numbers we've seen and the substantial controlling of the curve. But where the gap was maybe missed is the controlling of the narrative. So while the government was publicly issuing their mandate on social distancing rules, for example, the state governments had autonomy over how those rules were imposed. And we even saw local councils then able to impose their own rules. So, for example, in Sydney, some councils allowed beaches to open while others didn't. So that's just a quick government example, but if we take that down to an organisational level in terms of crisis management, and again, we've seen fairly mixed results of how organisations have handled those three elements. So in terms of the show in action, every organisation, small or large, was forced to show action. They had no choice. Where the gap has been seen is within the validating of concerns up front and then the controlling of the narrative. So we've seen many organisations have to ask their staff to take a drop in pay. But ultimately, the narrative across teams, across business units has been inconsistent as to why, where, for how long, and also lacking any kind of evidence to back up the decision that's been made other than trust us. This is for the good of all of us. So I think whatever the business models we're looking to put in place, whether that's tech, remote working, whatever it may be, the first thing organisations are really needing to think about is regards to managing their approach to people is how do they get better at crisis and change management in terms of validating concerns, showing action and controlling the narrative. So I just wanted to throw that out there before we get into this talk on business models changing.
No, mate, it's a good point. I think it's probably some of those points are valid across some of the future employee piece as well, right? But to point back towards then the operating models then, and then what tech is going to be needed to back that up. What's people's view of this then?
Yeah, look, I think definitely that they're good points, Matt. And what I've and client side, what I've seen firsthand is that organizations did not budget for the expenditure of setting up for remote work within an instant. We've seen some projects being shut down. Like, we've been impacted directly from some of that, and other times we've benefited from that. But on the ground, you can see the apprehension and the angst amongst the people working there. Like, what about my job? I've got friends that work in various banks, and they were at home for weeks doing nothing because their infrastructure would only literally support 20% of the workforce concurrently logging into work. So effectively, laptops were bricks. So I think moving forward, and yes, I truly believe organizations need to think around their resilience and this concept of anti-fragile, so that they need a digital first approach. So when you're putting in services, you must be thinking around, can I access this remotely? And to take a good example, like Google, they have this concept called Beyond Corp. And it took them 10 years to develop this, but essentially they don't have this big infrastructure. It's all peer-to-peer networks. So they just use the internet, which means when they have a service, they can use it from any device, which long as it's got some type of authentication and it's locked down, they have full remote capability. It's those types of models I think organizations need to look to, because it's not a matter of if it will happen again. It will happen again. So I think the technology stance is really important. And I think also to a budgeting perspective. So the costs, they need to factor in the costs of fixing up a lot of the legacy infrastructure they have just to set up remote. And then the other point, which I think, is something that is not done enough, which we advocate a lot for, is around observability. So not just observability of your services and application, but the people they're working on. Like, if you're working in an environment, you use Agile, are you measuring your points? Are you measuring velocity? Are you measuring your value stream? These are, I think, fundamentally important, because we have people remote working. They need to have this, there needs to be the communication and showing of the work and output that's actually happening. So I think technology will tie into making those available.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what Michael was saying. I think that when we think about organisations and we think about business models should actually help the organisation achieve its strategy, so wherever it's heading. And I think perhaps what's happening with COVID now and the uncertainty of the future, because we actually don't know what's coming in the next 6, 12, 18 months, means that some organisations will have to shift their strategies, or they will have to hone in and focus on certain areas. And that will drive a business model change, or maybe just a business model refinement. And I think we're starting to see that play out. I've been really pleased to see some organisations take really strong leadership, like from the start, and come out and say, actually, this is what's happening and this is what we're going to do. So I'd use Qantas as an example, and I know lots of people that have been stood down by Qantas, which is really, really disappointing to see. However, I really applaud Qantas for coming out of the gates and being really clear and transparent. This is where we're at. this is what's going to happen, this is what we're doing for you. Because in times of uncertainty, when we can't give answers, even if we just give, I will tell you at this date what's going to happen, you give people something to focus on, again, it helps our brains be more efficient. So I think we're going to see business model tweaks as we start to move forward. But I think the biggest thing, it's so unknown to everyone. Like, where's the playbook? We're just, you know, people are saying to me, I'm making it up as I go along. So that will be hard for us to cope with. But I think to Michael's point is that we have to remember that organizations consist of people. And whilst we have fantastic technology, we have fantastic digital innovations, we have data, we have systems and processes more efficient than we probably have ever had in some instances and less than others, we're still organizations at the crux are made up by people. And technology will enable people if we allow the technology to enable people. So we've had similar experiences, Michael, you talked about, with people in banks and other organisations have not been able to access things remotely. I'd imagine that we see organisations starting to shore up some of that, so they will be in a stronger position, not just for when it happens again, but even for the next 6 to 12 months. We're seeing quite a bit of data from employees now saying they don't want to go back to work. They don't want to go back to the office, like significant chunks of people, which means organisations are either going to have to force people back to work, which is going to definitely impact productivity and, you know, is very difficult and not a great thing to do, or they're going to be forced to enable people to work remotely. And we've seen productivity shifts go either way. Some people have become more productive, some people have become less productive. So I think we're going to see operating models that start to put some infrastructure around how we can continue to work remotely, how we can continue to be productive remotely, and the tools that allow that to happen. We're starting to see a little bit of an increase in tools that monitor people. So, you know, my business is about helping managers and staff collaborate around stress reduction and wellness and coming together in doing that. But we're seeing lots of other tools that are starting to monitor people. So employees are starting to feel a little bit like things are starting to get locked down. So while we need to measure, we need to be aware that, again, we're talking about people and giving them enough flexibility and freedom to be able to do their roles. So I think that's how business models are going to change. I think HR people, I know we have a lot of HR people on the call here. You guys are absolutely critical on how organizations will move forward, because I talked before about employees and people of organisations taking responsibility, and 100% will always stand by that. But the organisation has a very important role to play. And where we see organisations do really well is where people and organisations come together and do that collaboratively. So HR and people leaders, you drive the policies and strategies of your organisation. You ensure that people are feeling like they're supported, but they can work in a productive way. So I think we'll start to see that shift. I'm hoping we're seeing the role of the HR person start to shift away from just policies, more towards actually how do we create an environment where our people can thrive, where our people can be productive, where we're looking at the future roles of work. Because I think we'll see now the roles we have today will be quite different in the future, and that will be accelerated now through the time of COVID. So how are we planning for the future and helping people migrate from the skills they have today to the skills of the future? So I think HR in particular and those key sort of line managers can play a critical role in helping organisations transition from today to tomorrow, and the business model that needs to support that.
Yeah, I think one other observation I've noticed in regarding the tech or the breakdown of it, which is impacting some conversations, is some large organisation, I'm not going to name them, but they've offshored some key aspects of their workforce, like in India, to be specific. And what happened was, when the outbreak was there, they had to put in remote work. Now, I don't know, I've been in India quite a few times, and when you get outside those big buildings, the infrastructure is not reliable. There's no way they're running, as like for a major supermarket, their whole the operation for delivery was run out of a city in India. Outbreak happened there. They had to work from home. They weren't allowed in the city, but they have constant power blackouts. So they're frantically trying to figure out how they're going to run the time when these major supermarkets are supposed to be like, well, people are buying crazy. And yet people can go into work, and systems were failing and shutting down. They couldn't be supported. So it's asked the question around, what's your operating model when it comes to offshoring as well? Like, if there's a pandemic, are you putting your business at risk? So they're literally talking about, do we need to bring these services back onshore, which will change, I think, a lot of the dynamics as well. So it's something very interesting that happened for one large bank and one large retailer that I personally know of.
And obviously that's going to increase the demand and need for automation, right? And AI, everyone's worrying, am I going to be replaced by a robot and all the rest of it? And, there's probably some truth in some sentiment, but then how will organizations' talent needs change? How does that get defined? How do people plan towards it?
Yeah, look, I think there's a great book I read called The Rise of the Robots, and it talks around the day where like it said, like 70 to 80% of a lot of vocational jobs will be automated to some degree. And it's happening now, like, believe it or not, some newspaper articles that you're reading are all AI based. So a lot of the news columns, it's not a reporter, it's all AI. Yeah, but it's true, and it's happening. Like the legal profession, everyone thinks it's blue collar workers that are going to get affected by AI. That's not the case. Lawyers are under threat. Accountants are under threat. There's huge professions for AI comes through. And the interesting parallel I took from here and seeing what's happened recently is a lot of talk around the government say, well, people need to reskill, but it's not that easy. A lot of people, they just don't have the capability to stop being like a truck driver and start like software coding. It's just not going to happen. So I think, look, I don't have an answer, but I think that some thought needs to get put around this, and this should be a good impetus around the amount of people we rapidly saw unemployment. Again, this whole resiliency, how do we plan for that? And I totally agree with Danielle's comments around the role of HR. It's not just around like process and policies, it's how to equip people. And I think a lot of it is around some, I wouldn't say life skills, but again, like how do you transform your workforce so they're a bit more cross-skilled and a bit more pliable and applicable to other areas of the business.
Yeah, I think just to jump in and I completely agree with that. It's those comments around sort of, how do you HR needs to be more than policies. We don't have HR at Canva. We don't have a human resources team. We actually call it team happiness. Because we believe that that's what they really should be doing, working on empowering our employees, making sure that they're growing, progressing, learning, and more importantly, supported, right? So, a couple of the things that, we're very lucky that we had in place before all this kicked in was an employee assistance plan. So, most people are usually fine when, ticking on normal. Big crisis like this happens. Some people roll with it, some people struggle with it. And as a business, we need to support that. We have a lot of employees at Canva that aren't software engineers. We have a whole section of the business that's devoted to, managing vendors, managing the hospitality aspects of the office with the lunches and things like that. And, when we're not in the office having lunch, well, what do we do with the chefs? What do we do with the folks that are managing the office facilities if no one's in the office? So it's funny that you mentioned reskilling. I mean, this is kind of a stopgap, like a temporary fix, but we've actually found other opportunities for those folks to still be very, very useful in the business, ensure things keep moving. For example, let's use the lunch as an example, right? We have a bunch of suppliers that supply, fruits and vegetables and food and snacks to the office. Well, if we're not buying, then nobody else is buying, then what happens to them, right? So we've been able to sort of retool some of those people to keep our contractors and our suppliers on board. And then we've come up with this idea of, well, since, you're stuck at home and you're not getting lunch, why don't we take all that food, put it in a hamper, and then we can have the Vibe team deliver it, to employees that live within the city. So it kind of keeps the culture alive. It keeps the vibe alive. It allows, the business to still feels like Canva, even though we're at home by ourselves, not in, the environment that we're used to. But I think, like HR definitely needs to step in and drive those things because as Matt said, like, we're in a crisis, like people are panicking. They're not necessarily thinking straight. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that as organizations from the top, we need to say, correct, we're going to do this. This is how we're going to do it. You got to show that initiative, but at the same time, you have to think about the broader impact. So we've gotten very creative with how we've utilized people. We haven't let anybody go, not a single person throughout this whole thing. But it's not easy trying to figure out how to keep everybody, productive, but also have them feeling like they're adding value. And I think that's really important.
I love the team happiness, Francisco. Love it. I think we've got and you mentioned the EAP, and with businesses have had employee assistance programs. That's not anything new. There's still a real stigma around that. So I think we've got to lean into how we remove the stigma, and maybe we stop calling it employee assistance and we start calling it something more positive and affirming, performance development, or whatever we need to call it, some kind of performance coaching or something like that. I think we've got to acknowledge that even before COVID hit, we were already in a state of flux around change and transformation, and all COVID's done is it's meant that we're now seeing technology adoption. The curve has increased rapidly, right? Eric Astroteller, who's the head of Google X Technologies, many years ago, he said that we're at a time in human history where the rate of technological change is already accelerating faster than the human capacity to adapt and keep up. And he said that because since 1965, computer processing power has roughly doubled every 2 years. To put that into context, the computer that sent the Apollo mission to the moon now fits inside the chip of our smartphones, right? So we're already seeing machines able to do things that we previously thought were unique to human capability. They can beat human chess masters. They can compose music. They can recognize faces and translate language, things that we thought were previously unique to human capability. We've already been seeing the rapid outsourcing of jobs to developing nations where the labour force is cheaper. So the real question is, has COVID-19 slowed this automation down? Perhaps in some respects it has, but mostly we've seen a rapid and forced uptake of digital technologies. These technologies were available before COVID, but they weren't previously necessarily favoured or needed for whatever reason, right? So the question is, why did people not move to these technology solutions before being forced by COVID? And really, has this forced uptake meant that people now prefer these newly embedded technology solutions or ways of working over alternatives? And it's going to be a case-by-case basis, right? And that's what organisations, whether it's HR or team happiness, that's what we need to lean into, is of these new technologies, these new behaviours, these new ways of working, what makes sense to continue, whatever your business driver is, and what makes sense to pivot back to the old world.
And can you talk to that? I mean, look, everyone, the hot topic is, is remote workforces going to stay? And obviously the answer is there's going to be a mix of everything. There's going to be people that are needed in the office. People want to go to the office. People want to stay remote. But how do businesses plan for that? What is the method to getting it that is the norm?
I think it depends on the business, man. I guess, from my perspective, we always sort of plan for it going that way. We always plan to grow very quickly and grow very big, and we want to have an international footprint. So much to Michael's point, you had to have the technology in play, so, everything we can access cloud-based. We've got, single sign-on and all sorts of other security things to, make sure that no funny business is going on. All the devices are secured. There's a nice, strong security policy in place, but I think it's going to vary, right? Like you said, some people want to go, some people want to stay. Some people think they love being in the office, and now that they've had a taste of the remote life, they're like, oh, do I really want to go back? So I think it comes down to the point that there were probably people, and I have managers that are like, it doesn't work. For the most part, it's working. So I don't think you can say it doesn't work. I think at that point I think that argument's gone. But to make it work for the needs of your business, I think is where the give and take is going to be. And I think it's really up to the businesses and the people to come to an agreement on what that looks like. On one hand, I've spoken to people that are like, oh yeah, I want to live up in Noosa and I want to be flown in every week and I still want a Sydney wage. And it's like, all right, well, that's a bit too much. All the companies that do all remote workforce, like GitLabs, for example, tend to localize salaries and benefits based on where the person is. It's not like everyone gets the same thing. And I think you really have to plan all that out. You can't just say, everyone go remote. I don't think it's an issue of company will. I think it's about the like pragmatic realities of what that needs to look like in order to actually work and be fair for everyone across the board.
Yeah, I agree with that, Francisco. I think that, again, you look at the two biggest costs for businesses, it's staff and it's property. So they're the big two. And they bring in I hate activity-based working. I hate it. I'm just going to be honest. And some people like it. I'm sorry. If you one of those people, I hate it. And I actually once wrote like a page and a half to like our property people, like, don't sell this lie that activity-based workings to benefit and make me productive. No, you want to save in retail space. So property space. So I think this is actually, in one sense, business can use this as an opportunity to solve that particular problem. So again, I think not everyone likes remote work. I know some people don't. I personally love it. Like I don't plan going back anytime soon. But again, I think it helps the businesses in their cost modeling as well when they're growing, expanding, and we've seen, unfortunately, some businesses fail, but some other businesses are booming. So they've actually been able to enable some of that profit extension because they don't have to like outlay for expanding offices. So there's a bit of give and take there. And I think, look, it's definitely going to be a new norm. It's not. I don't think there's ever going back into what we sort of norm before. I think it will be definitely a new norm, and I think, I think that's it'll just take some time for people to work out and establish. I think organisations and people all need to be patient while we work through to figure out what that life will look like as well. And the other thing, interesting thing is I think which will impact is as we're seeing through this whole concept of staggered work hours. So if we do need to do this around using public transport and kids and people come in different times. The other thing, I think we touched on before, I think Laura mentioned before, is like contact times. If we do that staggered approach, we need to be thinking around, you may need to that might be it. Like if people are like starting later and finishing later, well, then you've got to be available for those particular calls. And how do you coordinate that? That was a big problem I tried to solve with teams within activity-based working. Like I was struggling to get the right people in at the right day. So when I wanted to have a meeting or collaborate, sometimes you need to collaborate, getting them there. It's a huge part to organize that time and day. And I think if everyone's remote working, I think we're gonna have similar challenges.
And that's where it comes from, right? Companies are gonna be forced to redefine cultures. And then you obviously have micro cultures. And I think as long as the business is comfortable knowing that those teams operate this way and I operate this, and then there's a standard across the whole business. But I think the balance is going to be people being scared. They're going to listen too much to the employees, or they're not going to listen enough, and then they're not going to do enough. And they're not, there's the next probably 6 to 12 months is, I've done too much. I've done too little. I haven't, and I think as long as employees and employers all realize that no one knows the answers to this, and it's just a work in progress, and they just need a constant iteration of feedback, right? But let's move into the next section then, which is all around the new world employee, because leads us in quite nicely to this. And first question off the rack is like, what is resilience, and how do organizations hire for and build it into their teams? And I'll hand you obviously to Matt to probably talk to this, given he's a resilience coach. But I do think obviously moving forward, this is, someone mentioned it early on, some people have coped with it, some people are not coping with it. Even probably the ones that are coping with it are going to start struggling when businesses redefine what is the new norm. But Matt, I'll hand it to you to talk to that point.
Yeah. So look, resilience is not a new word, right? It's just being used more with all that's being faced. And it was the word of 2020 before COVID, with especially in Australia with the bushfires that were being faced. So the word resilience comes from the Latin word resiliere, which means to recoil or rebound. And it was later translated into the noun we use today, which is resilience, the act of rebounding. So if you consider an apple and you put an apple in a vice and you wind that vice up, at a certain point, the pressure of the vice is going to cause the apple to explode. Now, if you unwind the vice, clean the mess away and put a tennis ball in there, a well-made professional tennis ball, and you wind the vice up to the point the apple exploded, the likelihood is that the tennis ball will stay intact. And when you unwind the vice, it will go back to its original shape and size. So this word resilience in terms of an object is it's the ability of an object to recover its original shape and size after deformation caused by that compressive stress. Now, as human beings, we're not being put in a vice, hopefully not. But if we consider that on a metaphorical basis, we're all being put through a metaphorical vice at the moment with everything that we're facing. And change and transformation was the reason resilience has been needed in the work we've been doing, the resilience training over the last few years. How do you help people to cope with all the change and transformation that's being experienced? And so in that metaphorical vice, we all have different pressure points, right, that we can go to before we reach the equivalent exploding. And so we've all got different levels of resilience. So in terms of the definition for resilience of a person, the resilience of you, the resilience of me, the definition we use is that resilience is a set of abilities that enable good outcomes in spite of serious threats. So a set of abilities that enable good outcomes in spite of serious threats. And we can really wrap threats up into three broad buckets: physical threats, psychological or emotional threats, and social threats. So COVID ticks all three of those boxes, right? Physical threats examples are things that threaten our physical well-being, or should I say our ability to cope with physical threats. So things like viruses, flu, things like injury, workplace injury. The next big one, ability to cope with psychological emotional threats, workload stress, task complexity, job loss. So there's some big ones there. And then the ability to cope with those social threats, so conflict with colleagues, team members, criticism on our work performance, and obviously a big one at the moment is social isolation. So as far as hiring for resilience, we're really looking to understand how a candidate can cope with physical, psychological, or emotional and social threats for thriving in even the most extreme circumstances. And the resilience research, the psychology research we use that underpins all of the work we do, is used to get the most elite people on the planet ready for the most extreme circumstances, right? So there's a proven set of abilities that can be learned to increase our resilience. And so in terms of hiring for resilience, something we're currently working on is developing a behavioural and psychometric assessment to measure the resilience of an individual. So that's one way you can hire for it. You can also use behavioural interviews, case studies, or assessment or simulation centres. I mean, I'm not a hiring expert. There's people in the panel today that can talk better to the recruitment process than I can. But we're really talking about resilience. In the AAGE in 2019, they surveyed many major organisations across Australia, and they identified that 80% of employers are looking to recruit with people with high levels of resilience. And I'm sure after 2020, we're going to be seeing that number even bigger. It's probably going to be close to 100% of employers are going to be trying to recruit for this thing, resilience. So hopefully that gives some context about what resilience is. Obviously, a big part of our resilience comes from experience and learning, right? Past experience. We go through certain situations, and then the next time we face a similar situation, we're better able to cope because we've been there before. And so the big example here is if you went through the last financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and you were working through that environment and you helped your family to cope through that environment, then the chances are the financial threats and all the psychological, emotional threats, etc., that were being faced in terms of the economical impacts of COVID-19, you're going to be better placed to cope with that. So past experience plays a part. There is some other inborn or innate stuff that we're either born with or we're not. For example, some people are born with stronger autoimmune functioning than others. Some people are more susceptible to autoimmune diseases and viruses and flu and whatnot through no fault of their own, just the way they've been born, their genetic makeup. So that's a big one. Having an easy temperament, having a good sense of humour, that's another inborn trait. Having strong cognitive abilities, so the ability to use your cognitive processing and reasoning to problem solve. So there's some inborn stuff, there's some past experience stuff, but there is a proven set of abilities that can be learned to increase resilience, and we can recruit for those things.
I think, resilience is a skill that can be learnt. And I think, fundamentally, though, it comes from mindset, and you need to, people who have that growth mindset, who are constantly looking to evolve, are constantly looking to learn from experience, are those that are going to have the greatest resilience. And, when I'm interviewing and looking at hiring individuals, I'm looking for the stories that they tell, that they see those setbacks that they've been through, change and do it again differently, or to take something out of it. They're looking for that silver lining. In that terrible experience, what did I take away from that I can reuse the next time? I think our roles, again, as leaders and as HR professionals, are creating those environments where we having open dialogue and having a safe environment for people to learn from their some of the things that I guess didn't go to plan, and allowing them to do it again, and not necessarily putting them down for it not working the first time. I think by providing that safety, it helps individuals build their resilience, because they can, they learn to get up again once they've stumbled, rather than stay down because they're too scared to sort of step up. Absolutely, I agree with you, Matt, in that, there are some people will have those natural innate traits that are better, that make them more resilient than others. But there is no doubt that you can learn to be more resilient.
Absolutely,
life skills.
And you've hit the key note there, Laura, mindset. Really interestingly, mindset, the definition of mindset is it's a collection of thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, values and patterns of thinking that affect how a person thinks, or what they feel, and then what they do. And that actually aligns really closely with organisational culture, being defined. An organisational culture is defined as the underlying beliefs, assumptions, values and ways of interacting that contribute to the social and psychological environment of the organisation. So there's a direct link between mindset and organisational culture. So I think you've hit the nail on the head, that if we can help get our people's mindsets right, then we can get the culture right. And a really quick example of the importance of mindset, and I'm not going to share research, and I think it's really great that organisations are starting to realise, and individuals starting to realise, that this grey matter between our ears that's responsible for firing electrical signals that make us move actually translates into what we think, feel and therefore do. And a very quick example of this, you've probably all heard the very recent story of Captain Tom Moore, who in the UK at the age of 100 raised £32 million for the NHS by dedicating himself to walking laps around his garden. You may not have heard the story of a young boy called Frank Mills, a 6-year-old from Bristol in the UK who suffers from spina bifida. He walked 10 metres, that's all he could walk, 10 metres every day with his walking frame, and raised £300,000. And he was inspired by Captain Tom Moore. So in our work, training and coaching many people in resilience during COVID, we've seen people from small, medium and large organisations across Australia and internationally who have got absolutely no reason to be feeling demotivated or lack of purpose, in a sense, compared to individuals like that who are able, these people who are sitting at home able-bodied and able-minded, who are feeling demotivated or lack of purpose. The issue is clearly not physical, so it must be mental, right? And I'm not saying people don't have reason to feel demotivated and lack of purpose. Of course we do, everything that's going on. But when you look at certain individuals who are able to, in this sort of environment, still find meaning, still find motivation when they're physically disabled or have a debilitating physical condition, and then other people who don't have that, it's mindset, isn't it? It can't be physical, so it must be mindset.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the resilience thing is really interesting, because as Matt said before, resilience isn't new. And Laura talked about mindset, and I totally agree. Resilience isn't new. I think what the challenge is now is the fact that we've got multiple fronts forcing us to be resilient. So previously, if we were talking about change at work or transformation, you'd have to be resilient at work because work was changing. But you could come home and it was cool. Home was fine. It was your safe haven. Now we're seeing across all fronts that we need to be resilient. So it puts a lot more pressure on our brain to be able to manage that. And fear does suck out quite a bit of our cognitive ability. So, you know, I talk to my team, we put new processes in place, you know, with this change, and we're a small team and we're lucky we can be flexible and agile and all the cool buzzwords. But we weren't able to do that. And we put something in place where we talk every morning. And the first thing I said to them is, guys, your brain is now half taken, because you now are focused on what's going on with COVID and focused on going on with your health and your family and your finances. So let's consider that you have just lost half of your cognitive ability, because that's what's happened to all of us. Now, with the rest, let's see how we can be productive and focused. And I had that conversation for a week with my team, every day for a week. And finally, by the end of the week, one of them said to me, now I know what you mean. So once we sort of accept, okay, well, resilience is the ability to bounce back. And Matt, you defined it beautifully. I can't even start there. I just think about it simply in terms of bouncing back. Then we can go, okay, once we're in that, once we understand what's actually going on, we can say, how do we move forward? And we give ourselves and each other permission to say, actually, it's okay or it's not okay. And I think that's where we start to get some really good collaborative and where we can, you know, impact the culture and stuff like that. But coming back, Sally, I think to your question that you were talking about in terms of the future role or the future employee. Now, I'm not a recruitment expert. We have recruitment experts on the panel. What I am seeing, though, certainly in terms of our organisation, but conversations I'm having with lots of customers and potential customers, is that previously, several years ago, we often used to recruit and find talent based on technical skills. So can that person code? Can that person understand a finance spreadsheet? I think there's a proper term for that. I clearly don't understand finance spreadsheets because I don't know the right term. But as the last few years, what I've seen, and certainly I think COVID has accelerated that, is actually starting to look for non-technical skills. In the past, people would call it soft skills. I personally get very offended because I think soft skills downplays the significant importance of some of the other skills we look for, like interpersonal skills, team building, problem solving, things like learning agility. So how quickly can we learn? We don't just go to school and university and then stop learning now. We learn throughout our entire career, the ability to be resilient, the ability to lead others, regardless of whether or not you're in a leadership role. So I'm seeing those capabilities start to become more and more critical as we move into the future of work. And I think that's really great, because then regardless what role you have, because you're absolutely right, Michael, it's not easy to reskill. And some jobs make it very, very difficult to reskill. But as we start to focus on some of those capabilities, they apply to any technical job. So if you can take those and we can find people, and as individuals, we can build those capabilities ourselves. We don't need to be in specific organisations to do that. There's an incredible amount of online learning these days you can find and build that yourself. Then you can start to be ready for the future of work, and you can be ready for those future roles. I know certainly when I'm recruiting in my company, and I have for the last 10 years, technical skills, yep, great, but you can teach someone technical skills. All of my questions, my storytelling, to your point, Laura, is all around the other stuff, what we consider the intangibles. How do people respond? How do they learn? How do they problem solve? How do they take really difficult situations and bounce back? So I do think that's going to be an important part of the roles of the future and employees of the future.
I love how you're describing the bounce back, Danielle. It's another way of thinking about it. It's not just bouncing back actually as well as bouncing forward. How do I not just go back to where I was, but actually become a better version of myself? And some of the skills, if anybody's interested, that point to high resilience, some of the abilities, self-awareness, self-regulation, and mental agility. So, and I think this points to what you were saying, Danielle, about some of those critical skills you're looking for and you're hiring for, whether that's in your businesses or your clients' businesses. So we look for people who are self-aware. Self-awareness is the ability to pay attention to your thoughts, your emotions, your behaviours, and your psychological reaction at any given moment, your physiological reaction at any given moment as well. But self-awareness is only useful if we do something with it. And that's where self-regulation then comes in. Self-regulation is the ability to take that self-awareness, to change or adapt our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviours, and our physiology in the service of a desired outcome. So people who are self-aware but can also self-regulate, they can change and adapt and evolve as they need to quickly in response to what they're facing. And then mental agility, that's the ability to look at situations from multiple perspectives, think creatively and flexibly in our problem solving. And the dichotomy of control is the quickest, easiest way for anybody to think about, how do I get myself through this? Focus on what can I control, what can I influence. So your teams right now, your people right now, the ones that are feeling most helpless and most vulnerable are likely the ones that are constantly focusing more of their mental energy. Again, going back to what Danielle was saying about the cognition being used up. People who are worrying about things they can't control, they can't influence, they're the ones that are going to be feeling helpless and vulnerable, whereas the people that are being proactive, are collaborating, are innovating, they're the ones that are going, asking themselves, what can I control? What can I influence? And they're taking purposeful action around that. So I think if you can help your teams, your people to fundamentally think and focus on what can we control here? What can we influence? Keep asking yourselves, your teams, that question: what can we control? What can we influence? And what affirmative action do we need to take? Because that's what Army Marines, that's what Navy SEALs, that's what high performing athletes do. I don't know if anyone's been watching the Michael Jordan documentary, but one of the comments about him was, how was he able to stay so present? He apparently was so present. And one of the things he was quoted as saying is, why am I going to worry about the shot I haven't made yet? Why am I going to worry about the game I haven't played yet? He's just, I'm prepared, I'm ready, I'm trained, my team's organised, we know what we're doing. I'm just going to enjoy the build up, and on the night we're ready to go. So that's elite performance, isn't it? And so that's what we've got to help our people to figure out. And that's what we should be looking for in terms of hiring for resilience.
Cool. And if anyone's got any other points on that, look, so another question then to you guys. There's obviously been many calls for restructure and how it's done, including, does the 9 till 5, Monday to Friday work day, should we go to it? Should we stay? I mean, obviously the New Zealand are trying to drive this 4-day week. I don't know if that's part of recovery or future world, but what does flexibility, what does a work-life balance look like in the future? What have we learned over the past 8 weeks, and how can we apply it moving forward?
I think I prefer the term work-life integration as opposed to balance. And look, this is personally what I've done. I've integrated my life around work to make it work, and it sort of fits a staggered workflow. So I think when people talk about work-life balance, it's like, is it a negative balance, positive balance? I don't think there is one. I think that it's, some people, a lot of people identify with their work. So a lot of people can switch off. They do the 9 to 5. There's other individuals. I'm one of them. Like my identity is my job. Like that's me. So, and I'm fine with that. And I integrate family around that. And I'm present when I'm doing family things. Why I think that's important is these are, I think, on a basis that people need to think around, like when they go back into, I think when organizations try to maybe reboot and think around allowing people back into the offices, how's that looking like? And this conversation around, do we stay remote working? And I think that people need to think about that, and organizations need to take that on board around the preference for some of the employees around that. Are they a balanced person? Like, do they need that bit of work and switch off, or they're integrating one? And again, I see a huge opportunity, a huge potential to get that right. And then, as Matt said, not just come back, but get back better for the organization, better for the individual. So I see a lot of consideration on a one-to-one basis. And really, when you think about like a lot of organizations, we spend so much time trying to recruit and retain and nurture those people. You want to get the best out of them. So have that conversation. I think that's a good opportunity to get the best out of your people and so it's not just good for the organization, but good for the individual.
I think it's a really exciting time, and echoing what you said, Michael, around, we have this opportunity to shape it and to make some real change. But it is down to an individual level, because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. But I think there is such opportunity out there to open up. There are things like, for example, being able to work remotely. Doesn't mean we need to be a remote first organisation, but having the ability to offer that means, we can now talk to some of our community where, our workforce, we have a lot of people who were not born in Australia. and who every year like to go back home to see their family. And historically in my career, it's always been, well, you need to take leave, and they want to take 3 months leave to go home because it's a long way to go. And, whereas today, I think, my mindset has changed and shifted, and I'm hoping that others in business have also had their mindset change, where it'll be like, well, you know what, you can carry out your role from your home country. You can go and spend a few months with your family in whatever country you've come from and continue to carry out your role and continue to perform and to continue to add value to your team and to your client or to whatever it might be. I think it changes the dynamics of the family unit and creates such great opportunity within families. And again, Michael, you can probably speak to this better than I can with a wife who's doing this PhD. But the fact that historically, for many, and I'll use stereotypes, but for many, mothers have done the school drop-offs and pickups and been the primary carer. And now having the ability to work flexibly from home, fathers now have the opportunity to participate in some of those activities and actually get to be present at some of those, key, times in their children's lives. But that also then allows the mother who perhaps hasn't been able to attend that 9 a.m. meeting and therefore has missed out on that information to start attending that. So I think it's really shifting the way the family dynamic works as well, and has really opened up, I guess, has really provided authenticity to people's interactions at work. We see our team members' families on our calls. We hear them in the background, and it makes our people real, and you get to know them. I think there's been some real benefits around this. Absolutely, there's been some downfalls, and hearing people talk about they're working longer hours. And we need to really work out how do we help them to not work those hours. And I think, again, as leaders, we have responsibilities to help educate and have conversations with people about what's needed and what's not needed. And I use an example of one of the girls in one of my teams. I had a conversation with her last week, and she was talking about she was quite burnt out, Zoom fatigue, and saying she's working longer hours, and she has this sense of guilt every time she walks away from her computer because she needs to do 8 hours a day. And initially when we transitioned, I had that same thought. If I went to put a load of washing on, I had this guilt, I can't be away from my desk. And I had a light bulb moment, which I then shared with her. And I was like, well, think about your normal work day and think about when you are in the office. You'll stop by and have a chat to someone in the kitchen, or you'll pop out and go and grab a coffee, or you'll go for a walk to the shops, or whatever it might be. Your day is not 8 hours sitting at your desk. It might be, when you really think about how many productive hours it might be, maybe it's 4 or 6 productive hours. Therefore, we need to make people feel comfortable they can do that at home too, that it's okay that they go and have a break or go out and get some fresh air or whatever it might be. So I think that the norms are changing. Flexibility is both a positive and a negative, depending on how you frame it and depending on as I go back to the boundaries you put in place. But I think it's a really exciting time. And also, the one more thing that I'm super excited about is this concept of being a digital nomad, that you can carry out your role and see the world when the borders open. I think it's such a brilliant, life skills to be able to have, life skills and see the world and understand how different cultures operate and be able to carry out your career and not have to put that on hold, I think is super exciting and opens things up, so many opportunities for so many people.
Yeah.
No, you've hit on so many notes from our from what we've seen in the resilience courses that we've been running during this last 8 to 12 weeks. And there's some really important points you've made. And I don't know if this is helpful to frame this conversation, but some of the key insights or the key concerns, I guess, we've seen coming through from, and as I said at the start of today, we've put through about 1,000 people. So before COVID-19, the biggest concern that people were having with regards to their resilience and coping was, how do I keep up with this velocity of change and not just collapse with exhaustion, right? So how do I juggle the increasing work demands? How do I not take work issues or stress home with me But then ultimately people were thinking about the future. What skills do I need to be more effective now, but also in the future? But then COVID hit, and the first 6 weeks of the remote working, the forced remote working, was the real sentiment was this working from home, insert with kids, if you had them, is really challenging, and being away from my team is actually really hard. So how do I juggle these changes to my financial, work, social situation? How do I separate work from home life? And how do I remain effective while working from home and keep in touch with my team? But then week 6+ of remote working and of COVID, what we've started to see is finally I have a new, people's sort of sentiment is finally I have a new routine sorted. But is that now changing, and what does the future hold? So what we're now sort of starting to see is, how do I cope with all this uncertainty? How do I keep the balance I get from working at home when I have to potentially go back to the office? People are feeling very protective of their new routine, their new working from home arrangements that they like. But instead of before COVID, the focus was on what skills do I need for the future of work. People are now asking themselves, what skills do I need to be employed, to stay employed in the short and medium term? So I completely agree with Laura's points that it is a really exciting time, but we're of the 90% that are really fortunate to be in employment. The 10% that's been predicted of unemployment across Australia, there's going to be some people that are really struggling, and even the people that are still in work, their loved ones may be going through struggles that, you know, we may not be aware of. So I think it's really important that we're mindful of how do we help people to remain effective, but also be there as a support if their families are going through challenges, and ultimately keep the wins and minimise the risks. So that's helpful to some of the insights we've seen. Is that consistent with what you guys are seeing and hearing across your teams?
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, to that point of, you know, how can we, you know, sort of, I guess, be there and be supporting? I think, you know, that, I guess we as the employed people, I think there is a bit of a responsibility on the organizations that employ us to allow for that sort of flexibility and to be understanding of that. Like, I'm 100% in Laura's camp. I think this is an incredible opportunity to really rethink that relationship, right? From a hiring perspective, you know, one of the key challenges that we've always had is that we're based in Sydney, and we need to hire a bajillion software engineers, but like Sydney's expensive, it's congested, you know, it's COVID central right now. You know, it's one of those things where there's it's not always possible to access talent in Brisbane, because people are like living well, you know, with a reasonable cost of living, and you can buy a house, you know, as opposed to trying to buy a house in Surrey Hills for like $4 million. So, you know, it's one of those things where we're really excited about the fact that it opens up, you know, potential, I guess, talent pools and skills and personalities that we wouldn't otherwise have access to if we were requiring them to move to Sydney. Facebook has this concept that they're looking at potentially having hubs throughout the US. And I know it's not cool to agree with Facebook, but I think they're onto something there, you know, because you do have people in places like Atlanta and Denver and Pittsburgh, you know, cities that people don't exactly think of as like tech meccas, you know, that have skills and things that they can contribute to the organization. So from that perspective, having access to more people and then having the opportunity to shape and bend a culture to allow you to acquire and ultimately set those people up to succeed, I think is a really, really important opportunity that we really haven't had, because pre-COVID times were good. You know, you were hitting your targets, stock market's up, everyone's making money, everybody's comfortable. And you forget that these things can happen. But I think, you know, to your point, the businesses need to be mindful that despite being an opportunity to grow and grow and grow and grow, to ensure those people are successful and ensure that they're happy, you need to adjust for the different situations and personality types. Like Michael said, some people are like, you know, integrated. I'm with you, man. I'm 100% in your camp. I can do this 12 hours a day and I love it. But my wife is like, boom, 5 o'clock, shut down, you know, and then she's looking at me like, it's 6:30, we need to have dinner. I'm like, oh, but this is, you know, this is going well. So, you know, it's, you need to balance for all of that. And I think what this has, I guess the opportunity is that we can now have that conversation. Like, you know, it's okay to say, hey, maybe we haven't been doing this as well as we should be, or like, hey, look what's happening in this sector. We don't want to be part of that. I think if business leaders are resistant to those conversations, and they got a whole set of other problems that they're gonna have to worry about. But I think if you can have that open transparency, understand that times are changing and they may not go back to the way that they were, but being able to actually have the people in the business pushing for a rethink and actually having those transparent, difficult discussions, I think will allow you to hire better people, ultimately provide a better experience for your employees. And I think will help in times of, crisis and ambiguity. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with work-life integration too, Michael. I just call it life because it kind of all wraps up together. There doesn't seem to be some separation or, difference these days. I think to everyone's points, I think the one thing that is clear is that it's not going to be the same for everyone. So everyone's in a slightly different position, whether you're employed or unemployed, or even if you're technically employed, you might not be employed at the level that you want to be because, they're saying that unemployment figures are hiding what's really going on. So I think we're all in slightly different situations. I think where it becomes critical for organisations is the leadership. So the leaders across all levels of the organisations and their ability to lead, because leaders are human like the rest of us. So where organisations I see are doing really well is the leaders are sitting down with their people, or not literally, but through this kind of forum, and they're talking to them. What's important to you? How are you feeling? Because really, most leaders have enough people that they can have a chat with. If you think of the CEO or the, chief people officer has to deal with the whole organization, that becomes incredibly overwhelming. But everyone's got someone that they can talk to. So if people are having those conversations and starting to get a sense of where people are at, it allows you to move forward collectively in a way that still enables people to be people in themselves, as well as get some sense of the organization. But I think it would be dangerous of us to assume that everyone wants something similar, because there's just such a variation now. And organisations don't always deal with variation well. So that's a challenge to think about, how do we manage that? But I do think there's opportunities, and I'm excited about the future, like the others are, because I think there's great potential. But I also recognise, as I'm sure we all do, is that fear does start to cause us to shut down. So the more concerned, the more scared we are of the future, the more we withdraw. So we know this from all our stress research. As we get stressed and pressure applies, we withdraw. We're less likely to communicate. We're less likely to understand what we need or be able to put it out there. So leaders in businesses, where you're helping your people feel comfortable, helping your people feel safe to share what they need and where they're at, that will help you transition into the future more effectively than if people are withdrawing and feeling scared.
Yeah, nice point, Danielle. The biggest fear trigger at the moment is, people can relate to this, is uncertainty, right? Other than the fear of, am I going to get sick? Is my family going to get sick? Am I going to have a job? It's actually, all of that is a big question mark. It's uncertainty, and we can't control a lot of that uncertainty, but we can control ourselves, or as leaders, we can help our teams to control and focus on what they can control. And it really comes down to controlling three things: mindset, habits, and the environment. Controlling what you can around that. We know mindset, we've talked about it as a practical and proven set of mindset techniques that can be learned. The most elite people on the planet use them for staying resilient through the most extreme situations. Controlling habits, we need to help our people get clear on what are the habits that are working for them, what are the habits that are not working for them, but then what is a habit and how do you change habits? How do you embed new habits? And that, I agree, comes back to the conversation around it's an individual basis. We all have individual habits, whether it's work-life integration, which, I think Jeff Bezos said that in his shareholder report last year. Work-life integration, forget work-life balance. It's about work-life integration now. There's the two aren't separate, they're the same. We've just got to figure out how to make them work and integrate effectively. So whatever that is, whatever that looks like for you and your teams, is what are the habits that will lead to optimal performance, to optimal well-being, and how do you control those? And then the final one is control the environment. Control the environment to remove small distractions and barriers to being at your best, to make the environment the best it can be for you and your team to operate effectively. So they're the three biggies with regards to uncertainty and fear. Control your mindset, control your habits, and control the environment.
I think they're good points, Matt. And I think we're probably at a position now where we've got more data points on that we never had before. Like, I know people ops are we're checking in with people so much more. We got all those data points. So like making it work, like I said, remove the barriers. Before, I don't think we had those conversations in it. As only as someone had grievance and I want remote work, get flexible work. Now it's en masse, we're having those conversations. So I think we're good, in a really good position. Pretty much and what I'm hearing from all the panelists here as well, it's happening in your workplaces. You're capturing those data points. I think that's, yeah, we're in a good position to get it better. If not right, definitely better than what it was.
And use that, use that data to determine who needs what help, who are the most at risk, and how do we prioritize our efforts and our resources to those people. And I'm not talking about people at risk in the broader society. We're talking about an organizational perspective, but who in your organization, for example, in mining, the people that are traveling long distances to getting to and from work, and then they've got 10 to 12 hour shifts, that's already a big stress for them. How are they then coping with everything else they're facing? So how do you focus your efforts? And absolutely right, Michael, we've got so much data, let's leverage it to focus efforts.
How many of you have actually onboarded staff remotely yet? And then the world that we're going into is obviously, the digitally mediated relationships, right? Where you've never met the person in physical and it's all remote. Like, are you seeing or got any tips and takeaways with people listening in still around that? Because obviously it's far easier when you sat down with someone to read sentiment and stuff, but the new world that we're going in, it's probably not new. People obviously would talk digitally, Tinder, whatever, all other apps, meeting apps, the rest of it would all be done digitally as a starting point. But from a working perspective, what are you guys doing to help integrate people that have never met in a physical environment and then keep those relationships and bonds?
That's a good question. I guess, the phrase we use internally is we've got to keep the vibe alive, while we're writing this out. And it's been interesting because not only do we have people that we've onboarded remotely and started remotely, we're still actively hiring remotely, to the tune of 30 to 40 people a quarter, despite everything that's going on. And that's just in Sydney. And there've been some logistical challenges there because visas aren't being processed. So say we have someone in the United States, we have to start and onboard this person in the US in a wonky time zone. Their mentor, because everyone gets a one-to-one mentor when they start for the first couple of weeks, is in Sydney. So what we have to do is really work with the mentors to figure out how we can get them to adjust to ensure that they're there for the mentee. We do sort of like virtual office rooms where we'll set up a Zoom hangout and everybody will just sit there and quietly work, just a bunch of 12 little heads just on the screen. But, people can pipe up and say something, or they can be like, oh, hey, I heard you got this, or, congrats on this. So you kind of still feel like you're sitting with each other, even though you're really not. We have this concept of social clubs at Canva. So for example, if you're interested in homebrewing, the business will actually give you a little bit of money every month to go and purchase some homebrew kit, and the team can get together, brew some beer, stick it in the closet in the office somewhere. We have basically, we're still supporting the club. So the clubs are still meeting. So we still have homebrew club. We still have beer tasting club. I actually took my mobile phone to the bottle shop around the corner and had the team pick out what I was going to test and try and rate. So we're trying to keep those social interactions going. We have teams that have been playing video games together. So they set up a Discord channel and, they're picking a free game that they can play. And, sort of Friday, 4 o'clock, everyone jumps on Discord, voice chat, and they're just having a good time. So I think for us, it's about keeping those interactions as frequent as possible, and using that to welcome the new starters, so that they feel like they're still part of the crew, they're not a second-class citizen being stuck, in some other part of the world because their visa came through before, after they cut the flights off, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been a hell of a challenge, but what we've done is we just want to make sure we're doing what we've always done, but a bit more high touch, with a bit more flexibility on our side to ensure that that person is set up to be successful. Because, if they don't feel like they're being supported, that's somebody that's probably not going to last. And we can't have that. So, yeah.
We've had a number of people that have started during this period. I think we've done when it comes to onboarding them into their specific role, I think we've done a brilliant job with that. And the way that we are structured as an organisation supports that. So, we work within squads. So, they have the opportunity to go into ceremonies. We've buddied them up with other people. So they're meeting on a frequent basis. But the piece that I think I haven't solved yet, and I'm certainly interested in how other panel members potentially have tackled this, or even the audience, is how do you build relationships with those that you don't interact with every day, working remotely. And, I've been with Contino now for 3 months. So I actually started just before the change. And, I guess I'm fortunate in the role that I play that I've had these opportunities to contact people that I wouldn't ordinarily work with. But I personally have missed those interactions that you would get from the Friday night drinks, or from the passing, meeting someone in the kitchen that I don't necessarily work with on a day-to-day basis. And I'm not sure how to solve that yet. And I'd love other people's insights into that. How do you build those relationships when you're not meeting them face to face? I don't know whether anyone's got any suggestions. We do things like donut pairings on Slack, and we have got some things in place, but
that's what I was going to ask you, if you have some sort of like coffee dates or pairings.
Yeah, we do. We've got a lot of social events that are running. So there are definitely a lot of social events, and we get great turnout from the broader business. But so if I have 80 people at a virtual social event, that's fantastic, except that I'm still not meeting, Bob Smith, who I would not necessarily interact with on a day-to-day basis. So I'm very conscious of the people that have started within our business in the last few months around how do we build those social relationships, because that's what they really are, and encourage those interactions, and how do we bridge that gap as if we continue to do this long term and don't necessarily have as many interactions in the office.
Yeah, we find the club system works really well. I mean, there's probably like 100 different clubs now. We have like nail painting club, where people get together and paint their nails, and some of the, anybody will just jump in and have fun. I think that, trying to, I guess, simulate the water cooler as best as you can, we found has worked very well for us thus far. And I also think when you can finally get everybody back together and get these people over and get everybody, like, those are warm relationships. Like, oh my gosh, I finally get to meet you. Like, this is so great. And I think that adds a bit of a celebratory vibe to that sort of, I guess, regathering of most of the people in the business, those that want to come back. So I think that's probably worked best for us. Just making sure that the vibe is alive. The company is still, for example, we have a quarterly all hands. I got this box. I'm not allowed to open this box until the all hands, but it's become a discussion point. So people are on Slack being like, what's in the box? It's like, oh, I weighed it. It weighed this much. So little things like that, that don't necessarily have to do with the job, but more with the community that you're trying to build with your business. And the vibe that you're going for as a culture, I think, is probably the way to go, because it's human to human, right? You're taking the metrics out of it. You're taking performance out of it. It's just a couple minutes of your day to have a laugh with someone who's just joined the business and make them feel welcome. So I think that's worked for us, and that's what I would, hopefully it continues to work.
I love that. I love that box. Do you know what's in it? Have you looked?
No. And literally, when Melanie, our CEO, was on a company all hands, which we do weekly, and she said, "Don't look in the box." And when Mel says, "Don't do it," you don't do it.
I think the real question here is, can we replace that feeling of being around other people in this environment, of being socially distant, physically distant? That social distancing, there was a big study published when COVID first hit by behavioural psychologists from around the world, who got together and collaborated to identify best practice for governments to help people through this challenge. One of the things they identified, that calling it social distancing is actually very dangerous, because it paints a picture of we've got to stay distant from from everyone socially, but actually it's physical distancing. We've got to start calling it physical distancing if we're going to continue with it. My wife's parents came round when we were allowed, and my God, it felt amazing just to have people in our presence. And we bumped into some friends on the street, and a week into COVID, and they were over the other side of the road, and even that conversation over the other side of the road was phenomenal. Can we ever replace that human to human in-person connection? There's a great TED talk by Sherry Turkle, Turkle, Connected But Alone. And she says that we are, and this was years ago, this was way before COVID. She said and as identified in her research, we're now more connected than we've ever been in history, but we are now more alone than we've ever been in history, because it's not real connection. It's not real Facebook friends, and not necessarily our real friends. And Instagram followers are not necessarily our real followers or our real, champions. So can we ever replace human to human connection? Everything is pointing to, all psychology research is no. So we need to help our people get back some of that with the social distancing that's being lifted, with the physical distancing that's being lifted, as quickly and as safely as possible, because it feels so good, and it's going to make them feel so good, and it's going to make their performance, their outcomes, their well-being lifted as a result. So great TED talk. Sherry, I'm sure it's Sherry Turkle, Connected.
But cool. We've taken up a lot of your time for being on the panel, so I appreciate you guys and your efforts and your contribution. And I'm sure we can talk about a million points we raised for an hours on each of them. And I thank you for the people that attended and listening. But unless you guys, I think we cut it there, and we can obviously come back and we can do another one with points that if you want a bit more prevalent. But unless you guys got anything else to say, I just want to say thanks to you all for contributing. Amazing. I've almost been sat there just like an observer, just wanted to listen more than anything else. So I really thank you for that. But unless you've got any other stuff that you want to throw out quickly to people, any takeaways, then do so. But if not, then
Charlie, there's a few questions that have come through on the Q&A. I didn't know if you wanted to, if they've all been covered. I haven't been keeping on them, but I've been seeing them come through. Is there any that
so Dan
wanted to pose? Any we didn't answer?
No, I don't think that there's some in there that, so Dan's been answering them and firing because they've been picked up. So as you guys have been talking, some of them have been covered off. And then there's one or two that are absolute rabbit holes that we could be here for another hour.
Save them for part two. Save them for part
two. But there's a couple in here that I could even answer direct, because there's one recruitment specialist, so me and Dan can take it offline.
Can I just say thanks to the other panel members because I've learned so much from the stuff that's been shared, and I've written a few things down, and some of the quotes: team happiness, keep the vibe alive, work-life integration, importance of mindset, all that stuff. So thank you. It's been brilliant. The fear stuff, EAP, everything. So thanks.
I've written some stuff down too. I like the vibe team.
Yeah. No, we love them. They're the heroes.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Me too. Thank you, everyone. And don't open that box.
I won't. I'll make it till Friday. I can make it to Friday. I'll be all right.
Good for you. Good for you. It's a pleasure, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, guys.